July 19, 1972. The coastal town of Mirbat, southern Oman. Dawn is barely cracking over the Arabian Sea. A fine monsoon mist hangs low over the desert scrubland, the kind that muffles sound, distorts distance, and turns the world into gray shapes. In the gun pit beside Wali's fort, a single man is awake. He is enormous, with hands like spades and a chest like a bulkhead. He has been sitting quietly in the pre-dawn dark, the way soldiers with serious experience sit, not restless, not anxious, but still. Ready. His name is Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba, known to every man in B Squadron 22nd SAS simply as Laba. He is 30 years old. He is 6 days past his birthday. And in approximately 90 minutes, he will do something so incomprehensible, so physically and mentally beyond what any military manual would ask of a human being, that his comrades will spend the next 50 years insisting he deserved the Victoria Cross. He never got it. He got a bullet in the jaw, kept fighting, got another in the neck, and died at his post. This is that story. To understand what happened at Mirbat, you have to understand what Britain was doing in Oman in 1972 and why nobody was supposed to know about it. The Dhofar rebellion had been grinding on since 1963. The People's Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, the PFLOAG, was a Soviet and Chinese-backed Marxist insurgency hell-bent on toppling the Sultan of Oman and planting a communist state on the southern edge of the Arabian Peninsula. If they succeeded, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow throat through which a staggering fraction of the world's oil supply passed, would fall under hostile influence. The Cold War chessboard demanded this not happen, and so Britain, quietly, without press releases or parliamentary debate, sent the SAS. They arrived disguised as a British Army training team BAT, 9 men at Mirbat, under the command of 23-year-old Captain Mike Keeley. 9. Their job was ostensibly to train local Omani forces, but the reality was sharper than that. They were there to fight, covertly, deniably, and with extreme professional competence. The British government had decided that if their involvement ever became public, it would create a political storm. So the SAS operated in near-total secrecy. No fanfare, no recognition. If you died in Dhofar in 1972, your medals were quietly distributed, and your name was kept out of the newspapers. This context matters enormously for what comes next, because it explains why a man who performed one of the most extraordinary individual acts of valor in post-World War II British military history received a mention in dispatches, the lowest tier of official recognition. Not because he didn't earn more, because the government couldn't afford for anyone to ask why. Laba was not a man built by the army. He was built by Fiji. He was born on July 13, 1942, in the village of Vanuatu, near Nawaka in Nadi. The Fijian islands had a warrior tradition that predated any British influence by centuries. To serve, to protect, to endure, these were not foreign concepts imported from a British military manual. They were values hammered into boys by their communities, their chiefs, their land. In Fiji, serving your highest chief was the greatest honor a man could earn. When the British crown became that chief, thousands of Fijians enlisted without hesitation. In 1961, 19-year-old Talaiasi Labalaba was one of 212 Fijians recruited into the British Army. He was posted to the Royal Ulster Rifles. The regiment noted him immediately, not just for his size, though at well over 6 feet and built like a rugby prop he was hard to miss, but for something harder to quantify. A quietness, a self-possession, the kind of composure that doesn't come from arrogance but from genuine self-knowledge. He knew what he was capable of, and he didn't need to shout about it. After 12 years of service, having honed his craft through the grinding work of infantry soldiering, Labalaba attempted SAS selection in 1966. Selection is a process designed to break men. The Brecon Beacons in Wales in winter with a Bergen rucksack that feels like carrying a small car up mountains that seem personally hostile. No coddling, no encouragement. You either finish or you don't. Of every 100 men who attempt it, perhaps 10 survive. Laba finished. He was posted to B Squadron and almost immediately deployed to Aden, where he ran covert undercover operations in one of the most dangerous urban insurgency environments Britain had operated in since Palestine. He earned the British Empire Medal for that work. Then came Oman. His fellow SAS men called him the Gentle Giant. That combination of words tells you everything. Here was a man of extraordinary physical power. Comrades would later describe him as the original Rambo when he was fully tooled up, who carried himself with warmth and quiet humor. He joked in Fijian with his countrymen. He was loyal in the bone-deep way that certain men are loyal, not performatively, but as a simple fact of his character. The SAS is not an organization that wastes words on sentiment, but the men who knew Laba speak about him in a different register than they use for most people. Something about him left a mark. The PFLOAG had been planning the attack on Mirbat for months. Their intelligence was good. They knew the 9-man SAS team was scheduled to rotate out of Mirbat that very day, July 19. They knew that the new team hadn't yet arrived. They calculated correctly that transition day would be the moment of maximum vulnerability. What they had assembled was not a raiding party. It was a strike force, somewhere between 250 and 400 fighters, many of them veterans, well armed with AK-47s, RPGs, mortars, and at least 2 Soviet-designed DSHK heavy machine guns. They had trained for this. They expected to overrun the position within the hour. At around 5:00 in the morning, the PFLOAG hit the picket position on Jebel Ali, a small hill north of Mirbat. The Dhofar gendarmerie men guarding it were killed. The sound of gunfire carried down through the mist to the bat house. Captain Keeley, scanning through the murk, saw the shapes of men advancing. Dozens of them, then more dozens. Then what appeared to be an entire army flowing across the scrubland toward Wali's fort and the town beyond. He ordered the 81 mortar into action. He ordered the signaller to get on the radio to SAS headquarters at al-Qarif, 35 miles away. He ordered his men to their positions on the sandbag parapet of the bat house roof. And Laba made a decision. The decision he made was the decision that defined everything that followed. 500 meters away from the bat house beside Wali's fort sat a WW2-era 25-pounder field gun. It was old, heavy, and under normal circumstances required a crew of 5 or 6 men to operate, one to aim, one to load, one to set the fuse, one to handle the breech. At minimum 2 more for the ammunition supply. It was the most powerful weapon available to the defenders of Mirbat. If it could be brought to bear on the advancing PFLOAG columns, it could break the assault. If the enemy reached it and took it, the battle was lost. The town was lost. Every man in that compound was dead. Laba ran 500 meters of open ground through early morning darkness, with hundreds of enemy fighters advancing in the same direction from the north. No cover, no support, just a massive Fijian sergeant sprinting across exposed desert toward a gun pit, because someone had to and he was already moving. He reached the gun. The Omani policeman who had been guarding it was seriously wounded. Laba assessed the situation in about 2 seconds and started working. Alone. A weapon designed for a crew of 6 and 1 pair of hands. What followed over the next hours was witnessed by his fellow SAS men through optics and later described in accounts that still carry the disbelief of eyewitnesses. Laba aimed the gun. Laba loaded the gun. Laba fired the gun. Around a minute by himself, at advancing enemy forces who were now close enough that he was effectively using a field artillery piece as a direct-fire anti-personnel weapon at near point-blank range. The 25-pounder fired a shell weighing, as the name suggests, 25 pounds. At close range against massed infantry, the effect was devastating. Wave after wave of PFLOAG fighters pushing toward the wire were caught by those rounds and shredded. The assault lines faltered, reorganized, and pushed again. Laba kept firing. Then the first bullet hit him. A Kalashnikov round struck Laba in the jaw. His jaw was, in the words of one account, smashed to pieces. He picked up his radio. He reported in. "I've been chinned, but I am okay." In Fiji there is a concept called bula, a greeting, but also a philosophy of wholeness, of life fully lived. Talaiasi Labalaba, with his jaw blown apart, alone at a six-man gun under fire from hundreds of attackers, transmitted that he was managing. He kept loading. He kept firing. At the bat house, Trooper Sekene Talaiasi, Sek, a fellow Fijian and one of Laba's closest friends, heard the transmission. He didn't wait for orders. He grabbed his SLR, told Captain Keeley where he was going, and ran. 800 meters through open ground swept by machine gun fire and mortar rounds. The PFLOAG fighters were closing from multiple directions. The barbed wire perimeter had been partially blown away by mortar salvos. To run that ground was to accept that you might die on any one of 100 steps. Sek ran it anyway. He reached Laba at the gun pit. He found his friend bleeding heavily, still working the breach. Together the two Fijians held the position, firing back with personal weapons while Laba, jaw destroyed, tried to keep the 25-pounder in action. From the small fort beside them, Wali Kamis, an Omani gunner of notable courage, emerged to join them. The three men held a position against an enemy that had them surrounded on multiple sides, at ranges sometimes measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. At the bat house, Keeley and medic trooper Tommy Tobin decided they couldn't stay back any longer. The gun pit radio had gone silent. Keeley contacted al-Qwarif, told them the situation was critical, requested air cover and evacuation, and then he and Tobin set out across that same killing ground that Sek had already crossed. They ran. They made it. What they found when they arrived at the gun pit was a scene of controlled horror. Wali Kamis had been badly wounded. Sek had taken a round in the back. Laba was still fighting. Then, as Sek later described it in the most devastating words of any account of this battle, Laba began crawling toward a 60 mortar nearby. He was almost out of ammunition for the 25-pounder. He needed another weapon to keep the enemy from overrunning them. He crawled toward it. "I was covering him," Sek said. "Then I heard a crack. I turned. All I could see was blood. A bullet had hit Laba's neck and blood was spouting out. He died within seconds." Talaiasi Labalaba died in the gun pit beside the weapon he had refused to abandon. He was 30 years old, 6 days past his birthday, and he died reaching for another way to fight. The battle wasn't over. Tommy Tobin had reached the gun pit and was trying to render first aid when a burst of machine gun fire tore through the sandbag walls. Tobin took a round in the face. His jaw was blown away. He fell. Keeley dragged him to what cover existed and kept firing. The PFLOAG fighters were at the wire, some of them close enough to throw grenades by hand. The situation had deteriorated to the point where individual soldiers were doing things that defy systematic description. One SAS trooper, unable to get the right angle with the mortar, hugged the barrel to his chest and fed bombs down it himself, walking the rounds onto target by feel. Two things saved Mirbat. The first was the cloud. The monsoon mist that had been hanging over the coast all morning began to lift. 2 BAC Strikemaster jets of the Sultan of Oman's Air Force had been circling, unable to engage through the weather. The moment they had visibility, they came down low and fast, strafing PFLOAG positions with cannon fire. The psychological effect of jets materializing out of the lifting mist, screaming low over men who had believed they were moments from victory, was immediate and decisive. The assault lines broke. The second was G Squadron. 22 men from the SAS unit at al-Qwarif had been scrambled almost from the moment Keeley's first distress call came in. They had assembled in 5 minutes, some of them still believing they were heading to the firing range until they heard the gunfire. They were helicoptered to the edge of Mirbat and fought their way into the port. By the time they arrived, the PFLOAG's attack had already been broken by the jets and by the impossible resistance of the gun pit. The communist fighters withdrew, leaving their dead behind them. When the count was made, 38 PFLOAG bodies recovered. Estimates of total casualties ran as high as 200, with perhaps half the attacking force killed or wounded. The guerrillas would never recover from the defeat, as one account put it. The Battle of Mirbat marked the beginning of the end of the Dhofar rebellion. The PFLOAG never again mounted an attack of that scale and ambition. The tide turned. It turned in that gun pit. 2 SAS men were dead, Labalaba and Tommy Tabin, who died in hospital from his wounds in October 1972. 6 Arab soldiers and an Omani gunner had also been killed. The price was terrible. What had been purchased with it was the survival of Mirbat, the survival of the SAS presence in Oman, and ultimately the survival of the Sultan's government and the stability of one of the most strategically vital corridors on Earth. Here is the great injustice that follows a great act. Because the British government had never officially acknowledged the SAS presence in Dhofar, the gallantry awards handed out after Mirbat were deliberately suppressed. Captain Keeley received the Distinguished Service Order. 2 men received military crosses. Tommy Tabin received a posthumous Distinguished Conduct Medal. Labalaba received a mention in dispatches, the lowest formal recognition available. A posthumous Victoria Cross was proposed. His comrades pushed for it. The reply, as one SAS veteran later summarized with barely contained fury, was that giving Laba a posthumous VC would put headlines in every newspaper in Britain, and those headlines would ask questions nobody in Whitehall wanted to answer. So the greatest individual act of valor in the Dhofar campaign went essentially unrecognized in public for years. Former SAS Sergeant Pete Winner, who fought at Mirbat and later served at the Iranian embassy siege, put it plainly. The guy deserved a VC for what he did. Sergeant Talaiasi, who ran 800 meters under fire to reach his friend, who held his friend's gun position after that friend died, who recovered from his own wound and kept fighting, was equally direct. I think all the people involved should have been given medals. They weren't, not because they hadn't earned them, because the government found the truth inconvenient. There is a particular kind of courage that has no audience. Labalaba did not run to that gun pit because cameras were rolling or because he calculated the odds of recognition. There were no cameras. There was no recognition coming, and he likely knew it. He ran because the gun needed to be manned, because without it the town fell and his comrades died, and because he was the man closest to it who was still on his feet. The 25-pounder is now called the Mirbat gun. It sat for years in the Royal Artillery Museum at Woolwich. A statue of Labalaba stands outside the warrant officers and sergeants' mess at SAS headquarters in Hereford, one of very few individuals to receive that honor within Sterling lines. A second statue was unveiled in 2018 at Nadi International Airport in Fiji by Prince Harry. The inscription reads, in Fijian, Ruravaka na kaluka doka na tui. Fear God and honor the Queen. In 2012, the BBC named him one of the 60 new Elizabethans, individuals whose actions during Queen Elizabeth II's reign had shaped the life of the nation. A Fijian sergeant from a village near Nadi, who fought a secret war in the Omani desert and died at a gun that wasn't designed for one man, listed alongside scientists and artists and heads of state as someone who mattered to Britain. He is buried at St. Martin's Church in Hereford, a few miles from the regiment he gave everything to. His headstone carries the cap badges of both the Royal Irish Rangers and the 22nd SAS. 2 regiments, 1 man, a whole life measured in the currency that soldiers use, not years, but what you did with them. What Mirbat proved, and what Labalaba embodied, is something the military academies struggle to put in a doctrine manual, because it can't quite be put there. Training produces technique. Experience produces judgment. But what Laba demonstrated on the morning of July 19, 1972 was something that precedes both, a form of will that simply declines to accept the situation as it presents itself. By any rational calculation, one man cannot operate a six-man gun under direct fire while absorbing a round to the jaw, while hundreds of enemy fighters close from multiple directions, while his only support is a fellow wounded man and a handful of comrades 500 meters away. The arithmetic of that scenario produces one outcome. Laba rewrote the arithmetic. His comrades say he held the advancing forces long enough for Sek to reach him, long enough for Keely and Tabin to make their run, long enough for the radio call to reach al-Qwarif, long enough for G Squadron to scramble, long enough for the clouds to lift, long enough for the strike masters to find their targets. A chain of survival, every link of it dependent on the one that Labalaba forged alone, at the gun, on the morning of his last day. Roger Cole, a fellow SAS trooper who wrote about the battle in SAS, Operation Storm, stated it directly. If the PFLOAG had taken the 25-pounder, the SAS would have lost the battle. The gun pit was the hinge of the entire action. Laba was the gun pit. One man holding a six-man position, with a shot jaw and a dying loader, until the world caught up with what he was doing. The Dhofar rebellion officially ended in 1976. The Sultan's forces, backed by British training and SAS direct action, had prevailed. The communist insurgency that had threatened to redraw the geopolitical map of the Persian Gulf was defeated. In 4 years of SAS involvement, the regiment lost 12 men in total. Talaiasi Labalaba was one of the first, and in the judgment of those who served with him, the most irreplaceable. His village in Fiji still remembers him. The people of Vanuatu near Nawaka near Nadi call him a brave heart lion. He left that village in 1961 as a teenager. He never came back. But the statue at the airport means that every person arriving in Fiji, tourists with their beach bags, families coming home, businessmen, diplomats, passes the face of a man who once stood alone at a gun in the Omani desert and decided that today was not the day to stop firing. He was 30 years old. He had already lived more, given more, and endured more than most men accumulate in twice that time. His Fijian motto, carved into the memorial his comrades spent years fighting to build, captures what he was in 4 words: fear God, honor the Queen, and fight, apparently, until there is nothing left to fight with. That is Talaiasi Labalaba. That is what a man can be when he decides, without fuss, without witnesses, without any promise of recognition, to be exactly that. The gun is in a museum now. The man is in the ground in Hereford. But in the SAS, where ghosts are kept close and tradition is worn like armor, Laba is still present. Every trooper who passes his statue outside the sergeant's mess at Sterling Lines knows what it represents. Not a relic, a standard. Some standards can never be surpassed. They can only be aimed at. Sources: Roger Cole and Richard Belfield, SAS. Operation Storm Hodder and Stoughton. General Sir Peter de la Billière looking for trouble 1994. Battle of Mirbat accounts from Britain's small wars, Imperial War Museum memorial records, and testimony from 2nd Attackfc DCM and Peter, Snapper, Warren.